Your alphas in the boardroom who are very used to being right and having people dance around them, they're missing out on a lot of trust. They're actually in a trust deficit, partly because of interruption. A person who's really talented but doesn't quite feel heard is putting in 80%. For your business, that's an inefficiency. You're not going to get the extra 20% out of that person. So there will be quiet quit, long-term quiet quit.
Hi, I'm 𝗬𝗲𝗹𝗵. In Choices and Chances, I use my own style of interviewing, honed through decades as an international news presenter and correspondent, to delve into a new topic each week and interview some of the most inspiring people in the world. Life is a series of choices that give us chances to live our best lives. My goal is to turn the wisdom of people I talk to and lessons from my own experiences into ideas you can use. So if you'd like to be inspired by others' stories, hit the subscribe button and join the community. Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. It's great to see you.
My pleasure. Good to see you again.
Just a bit of background. Mark and I met very soon after I arrived in Sydney. Actually, I was looking for work opportunities and our paths crossed then. And I was looking to probably get into the cultural space, the multicultural marketing at the time, marketing and events space. And that's where Mark was. And I think it's accurate to say that Mark and I strongly relate to multiculturalism, given our personal and professional backgrounds. But I'll let Mark do the talking on that one. It's a great place to start. Mark, just tell us a bit about your background and what goes into your identity, given your exposure to a lot of different cultures.
Thanks, Tessa. Well, yes, like yourself, I've been exposed to different cultures and languages all my life. I grew up in Australia as a third generation Greek Australian, but believe it or not, my first language was Greek, and I was exposed to my grandparents from a young age and had the benefit of being exposed to two cultures and two ways of thinking, if you like. In particular, the Greek food that I grew up with became such a big influence on my life, and my love of food and my curiosity about food in other people's cultures. And it took me to work overseas as an international aid worker for the bulk of my career in many parts of the world, but particularly in Southeast Asia and in Timor-Leste in particular. And I think it was my parents' travel stories and my grandparents' stories of back in the village that made me curious about a world that was beyond this wonderful city of Sydney that we really love, but there's something bigger out there. And that drove me to study international relations and then work overseas. And I started my international development career in Vietnam, of course, which has just evolved so much as a country since then. And I'd also spent a bit of time teaching English in China, and then later on worked at the United Nations University in Japan before the biggest chapter of my life so far, which was working in Timor-Leste, firstly as an aid worker, development worker, as they say now, but also running a social enterprise, celebrating the food, coffee, and tourism in an emerging and then at that time, post-conflict Timor-Leste.
Something that you kept mentioning is your curiosity. And I think for people like us, it's something that's been almost imposed when you're young, because you're exposed to very contradictory concepts in your life very early on, and you wonder why, and then you start digging. I want to know your thoughts on curiosity. I'm a very, very strong advocate of people just fostering that sense of curiosity. But of course, everyone has different reference points and different backgrounds, and it may be stronger in some than others. How important is that for you? And what do you tell people about what curiosity plays in people's lives?
Yes, I'm trying to think of if there's a more important character trait in a way than curiosity, because it brings you an openness to the broadest possible experiences that we have in life. And I use food as an example, but it could be music. It could be just talking to a person from a different culture. It could be that when you travel, you're a little more open to try something new, to visit, to really get under the roots of a culture, to go into somebody's home when they do invite you, and just let it flow and let it go in a way. And I think I got that curiosity from my dad, who spent 1.5 years of his life traveling across the hippie trail of Asia as a almost like as an observer, not saying a lot, going to temples, embedding himself in different scenarios where there's different religions at play and different ways of dressing and different temperatures and different cultural experiences. So I really just like being an observer. I do love a chat. I'm enjoying this chat with you, but I like also being an observer. And I think part of curiosity is about listening and deep listening, as we have, which is referred to in many cultures, many indigenous cultures, just being and just absorbing and soaking up what's there. And probably, how you get to a point of, let's say, hyper curiosity is overcoming a few fears that you might have, learning to live in the moment and learning to really just put yourself in a position where you don't need to be the dominant communicator and get your needs met immediately. And that can be hard coming from an individualistic society where, there's small families and we're always told that our needs are important. So I think to put it in more concrete terms, I think living in Japan for 4 years was a really instructive period for me, working in Japanese office environments where I was a minority. I couldn't understand what was going on. And I had to then go back into myself and really start to understand and pay more attention to body language and those other non-verbal cues that we have out there. And while I did try with the language and I picked up a good chunk of it, I would say it's not the same as being from that culture and learning that language. So I think what I'm saying there is to be comfortable being an outsider as well.
I agree with you that it's hard to think of a value or trait that is more important than curiosity and bridging divides. And you don't have to travel far. I do encourage traveling if you can, if you have the means and ability to do so. But even just talking to your neighbor who might have a completely different opinion to you, I think that is already just crossing a divide, right? Now, there is a conversation around the world whether or not the world is increasingly divided, or is it just a perception we get from media coverage of what's happening in the world on a geopolitical scale, as well as online trolling that we do see online. It is true that there are different views in the world, and your background informs that view. Which camp do you belong in? Are we as a society, as humankind, getting more divided? Or are we increasingly more global and interconnected, just like you and I? I'd like to believe in a more positive view, but what camp are you in?
Ooh, that is such a great question. Let me start by saying I think that the divisions are probably different from, let's say, the pre-internet age to the current age. So I think, from a Western point of view, divisions beforehand would have been around, the West versus what was happening beyond the Iron Curtain, or in the developing world, for example, or in China, where you have these different ecosystems. Now I think with technology, we're being actively encouraged to be divided through the social media giants, because they have an interest in sort of fomenting that sort of passionate discourse that goes beyond debate. So in other words, clickbait and YouTube rabbit holes that we all go down sometimes are really great for business. And so I think it's a very different type of division than before. And we've seen that in the recent election in the United States and the one before, the two before actually. So I think we are probably more visibly divided, and I think there's other divides that have crept up upon us that we maybe haven't thought about. And they're not the old religious divides, and they're not the old capitalism, communist divides, but they're divides around the way that we perceive society, the way we perceive technology. So if I had to say if we're more divided, I would say more divided overall, even though we're in a more peaceful world than we were 30 years ago, believe it or not. So I think the divisions, the capacity to be triggered and divided is much higher now. And governments are, as they usually are, 10, 15 years behind technology to be able to regulate that, so that we don't see what we saw in the UK recently, or we don't see the divisions that we see in the United States. For example, a final point I'll make, and it's probably just something to provoke the listeners a bit, is China is so important in the world, a huge chunk of the world's population, and they exist in a completely parallel, I call it a Galapagized ecosystem of technology. And I find that's a concern, and I'm not putting blame on one party or another there. I'm just I think it's a pity that we don't have more sort of communication across technology. So any platforms that do sort of facilitate that technological coming together, I'm really a big fan of, actually.
I think you make a great point on the presence of technology, because it kind of directs what we end up doing, whether consciously or not, but also in that we end up in the rabbit hole, but also the echo chambers at the same time. So that's the global view, but at the same time, there's the individual view, right? As I get older, you hear a lot of people saying, oh, I want to protect my peace, my calm, and therefore I don't want to listen to things that will disrupt my peace. And that could mean anyone that I don't agree with, I really just don't want to deal with. Or do we go out of our echo chambers and make an effort to listen to opinions that probably rub us the wrong way? But is that the way to understand our neighbors, so to speak? So I don't know, on an individual level, you were an aid worker, you've encountered a lot of things that were contradictory. How do we as individuals do that? Tech companies aside, but how do you step out of your echo chamber? Do we really want to?
Well, that's a hard one. I actually heard the amazing 𝗬𝗪𝗚 talk about this the other day, and it gets actually back to deep listening and to actually really to move out of the echo chamber. You actually physically have to stand opposite someone that you disagree with, and I mean face to face, as great as this technology is, and to hear a view that really cuts to the core of who you are and really makes you feel awkward and feel that this person is not human. Like that's kind of where we're getting at in the West, which is people are not only talking across each other, but they're dehumanizing the person with the different view, because the views now can be so different and they've been so provoked with misinformation that we see. So it's really difficult. It's really difficult to do. And I think it's about holding back a bit of judgment, maybe just learning to shut this one. We've got two of those and one of those. And that's really hard when you let's say you're in the media game and you're passionate about free speech, let's say, or in my case, you're an aid worker and you're passionate about women's rights, and then you hear a view which is contrary to that, which is informed by a lifetime of, it can be a religious or a non-religious view and the patriarchy and whatnot. It's really hard to stand there and go and not point a finger. So I kind of, in a way, challenge everyone to do that once in a while. And it doesn't mean that you are validating that person's point of view. But if we go the other way and we continue to point fingers and dehumanize, we're not going to go anywhere. So it's a tough one. I think it gets back to deep listening.
Yeah, it is.
How do you handle it in your work, Tessa?
Well, yeah, it comes up a lot because you also have to, I've sat across from people whose opinions are completely different to mine, and some, drastically different, in a way that you kind of have to really put yourself in their shoes to understand where they're coming from. And that was the goal. I mean, I wasn't a policymaker, so my goal is not to fix the problem at that moment, but to just understand where they're coming from and hopefully shed a light. It's not always easy, but of course you also have to know when to challenge, when something is factually incorrect or something is bordering on bigotry. There are those moments, and I had a debate show, and there are elected politicians who will be very provocative. So it's just knowing that line, but also listening, and not it's not about me, it's about this person that I'm talking to, and trying to understand where they came from. Also, even living in a country like Russia in the past, I've encountered a lot of my friends who would say, it's very difficult to communicate this to non-Russians because no one has lived through what we lived through historically. So it's really a completely different perspective. I can say that about the Filipinos. I can say that about the Hong Kong people. Australians are the same. So yes, I totally get what you're saying. And what's interesting to me is you keep going back to food, and you started with this, and it's really something that's huge for you. So let's go to the food side of your story. So you started Agora Food Studios. That's a big part of your story. And I'd love to know what the intention was behind that. But I also like the part of it where, yes, you're different from a lot of people, but you seem to have a whole lot of confidence in yourself, because this project had a lot of naysayers who said it's going to flop, it's going to fail. You did it anyway. So tell us about the story of the Agora Food Studios.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I have to say, it's a story of at least two people, because I had a co-founder who had a great vision and a great sense of determination that combined with some of my acumen around people management and working in international aid, leading international aid programs. It was kind of a very good combination of skills and passion to have. We both, Alva and I were both lovers of food in that sense, but essentially the motivation came out of working in the international development industry, which some people call the international development industrial complex. You can see it as large contractors and donor governments working in post-conflict countries and fragile states, and seeing that as expats with the privilege there to spend our money to eat out in an island country, we were literally putting our money into inflation and into imported food, meaning that the food that we were eating in Timor-Leste, your listeners may know it as East Timor, the chicken was from Brazil. I call it the 20,000 kilometer chicken. Wow. The rice was imported from Vietnam, the beef from Australia, the terrible cheap packet noodles. And so you're actually working to help develop a country's agriculture and nutrition, which is the projects we were working on. But at the same time, you can't actually support that in your daily life because the hospitality industry wasn't providing that. So that gap in the market to do, instead of having a restaurant where 90% of the food was imported, to have a restaurant ecosystem where 90% of the food was local, supporting local farmers, less impactful in terms of fossil fuels, using less plastic, all the great things that you can do by using a local food chain. We thought we would be, we were amongst the first to do it. We also had another operator, César Gallo from Delicious Timor, who was opening at a similar time. So we really kickstarted a movement to celebrate and validate local food. That was food people were eating behind the kitchen curtain in a way, but they didn't have the confidence and the knowledge in some ways to put it on a plate for an international audience. And it was an interesting space to be in because it's interesting because from different parts of the spectrum, you get different comments and criticisms. So actually funny thing was from the far left, you would get accusations of cultural appropriation, right? So, which is sort of it's a do nothing approach to supporting local food chains in a way. And then from the far right, you would get accusations that, well, you can't work in this country. It's very difficult, which it is. Disparaging remarks about, well, the people are untrained and the cleanliness is not good. It's never going to work. So I think as an entrepreneur or a social entrepreneur, that's a blessing to have that commentary. But you've got to put your life into it, your whole being, your heart, your stomach, literally, to make it work. So what we did in a way was flip the paradigm and make the local food sexy for an international audience first. And so it's a really important thing for those countries that haven't developed that culinary cuisine for a tourism market to diversify their economies. And it can be controversial. So the framing is really important. People say, well, why do you need to do it for an international audience first? And the quick answer is, after 500 years of Portuguese colonial occupation and illegal Indonesian occupation, people were not validating their own food. They were, in some cases, ashamed of it, and they didn't talk about it. Even though it might be delicious, nutritious, it's 100% organic. It's got all these things that in a Newtown cafe would be high value, but in Dili at the time, people just weren't sure, how do I eat this? And is it safe to eat? So all those concerns. So that was our motivation for starting.
And you also did see the business side of it. I mean, at the end of the day, it's got to be sustainable financially as well. So you did have confidence that it was going to be profitable.
We were not really sure, to be honest. And what, in the end, we already had within us those skills from international development, which are really important around understanding how to engage communities, taking into account gender dynamics, inclusion, being pro-poor focused in terms of, you've got a lot of urban migrants who are looking for work. How can you include those people in the ecosystem? So we already had those values and those skills. What we didn't have was the really hardcore business skills of how do you develop a product, market a product, sell a product with enough cream off the top that you can then reinvest in a business. And so that's where the social enterprise model is important in 𝘁𝗏𝗏. And I don't think it can be done otherwise. So 𝘁𝗏𝗏 presents a range of challenges where you have to develop skills from scratch, where people have a very low level of numeracy, for example. They might have high passion and knowledge of their local food, but how to serve a customer, how to calculate a price of a meal. So we had to kind of teach ourselves how to do that from scratch and develop a little bit of a business, a harder shell around us. And that meant you have to price things so that you can make a profit. And also coming to terms with, as a person that had been socially orientated my whole life, changing my identity a bit and coming to terms with the fact that profit is very important. Profit doesn't necessarily mean gouging, but how do you invest back into your team and your people? And how do you create a nice space? And how do you create hygienic food without a good water filter system, whatever it happens to be? How do you get the best product from the remote mountain area if you're not prepared to pay a bit more for it? So we had to develop the business skills to complement our existing philosophies around social inclusion and poverty alleviation.
Yeah, that's a fun part about entrepreneurship, isn't it? Learning all these things on your own. I want to pick your brain on what you said about your skills from international aid development on engaging with communities, because I think that is such a useful skill in entrepreneurship. So what are the tips, practical tools to engage community that you brought to the business?
That's the hardest question of the lot, I think. I think it's evolved. I think my answer to this question's evolved over time. I think it's about gets back to deep listening again and food in a weird way. Meaning I was part of a number of projects and programs where, looking back on it now, I don't agree with the approach on community engagement, which is still very much driven by the non-government organizations and the government. So it's still very much the ideas are coming from the wrong place to have an impact. So effective community engagement, in my view, is where the community is initiating. And they're the ones actually coming to you, whether you're non-government or a government organization, saying, these are the challenges we have that we want to do something about. If we, in the dance that occurs between communities and service providers, if we step too much into their side of the court, then we know historically in colonized communities that they will then start to give us answers that we're looking for. In other words, if I come in with an idea and say, oh, wow, you've got a fallow field over there, we can grow some vegetables. They say, yeah, we could grow some vegetables, right? So, and those ideas will usually fail. So if it was a spectrum, I'm very much on this end of being a little bit sitting back and waiting. And so the same applies in trying to set up a local food movement. You want to make connections with community in terms of communication. So you want to reach out. But if people are not coming with a product, and if it means they're not ready yet to sell it, they might need some development and some training support to sell it. So we want to be working with the people that actually want to work with us. And so in high context cultures, that means yes is not always yes. You got to watch behavior. So to answer your question in relation to Agora Food Studio, because we got the word out there through our team and our staff who were from rural areas by and large, and mountainous remote areas often, occasionally farmers would just come of their own accord and share something with you, some produce, a unique product that even you may not have heard of. And that already tells you the incentive structure's right. They're already making an effort. So we need to support that person who's entrepreneurial. But if we're going to support a person that's in a government position for 15 years, who's used to people coming to them, those reverse incentives apply. So my view, I think, has changed over the years. It's a little bit more laid back and sit back rather than to implant ideas in the minds of a community who might just nod their head for several years because they think they can get money out of it.
If you can single out a few pivotal moments where you had to make a difficult choice, if you will, what were they, and probably shared lessons learned?
Difficult choice would have been to leave a well-paying job in the in the aid industry. I was working for the German government at the time, leading team leader of the national youth training project in 𝗵𝗺𝗧, and to then go out and invest money that I had earned into the social enterprise. Probably the hardest choice of all, not knowing what's the income coming out the side of that. Definitely the hardest one. And also the fact that you've got a 6-month setup for a business like that. So you're actually going without income. So I think for anybody who's, grown up with tough financial circumstances, that's a really big risk to take. You don't want to let people down around you, your partner, your family. So that's probably one of the biggest ones. And then I think a general risk that both Alva and I took running Agora Studio was really the art of delegation. Early on, letting go of some of the key functions that we had established and being prepared to trust our team to run certain elements of the business. For example, it could have been the coffee, lunch, running the lunches, running a catering event, and then eventually running administration, and then eventually managing the business. So we needed to keep an eye on everything. And I heard a great phrase the other day, by the way, which is for any budding entrepreneurs out there or founders who are grappling with this idea of letting go, and I can't let go because it's my baby and that person can't do it as good as me. We tried to, and we learned how to, over time, embody the philosophy that we have our noses in everything but our hands on nothing. And that was not in terms of choices and changes, that's an 8-year process, potentially. 7-year process, actually, in our case. And when COVID hit in early 2020, after 4 years running the enterprise, we're in a position where the capacity, the ability of our local counterparts to run the business mostly without us, with some exceptions, like in the marketing area, financial management, some of the strategy, and that's normal in any business. We were able to leave 𝗵𝗺 and make probably the most difficult choice of all, which was to leave the country. And we actually got the last flight out of Dili literally back to Australia, and the business was forced to close and the future's uncertain. So was it a wise decision? It might have had some luck to it, but it was made on the basis that the capability of our amazing 5 new owners now, I can give them a shout out, Paula, Alu, Eulalia, Anna, and our lone guy, 𝘊𝗀. They were in a much better position to be leaders at that stage, and therefore Alva and I could make that decision to leave 𝗵𝗺. So that's probably the biggest risk we've taken. And there's others along the way. And then I'd say the final one to wrap up the question is the risk of making a decision in early 2023 after 7 years to fully hand the business over. And that we had our handover ceremony in April of last year. So the team's been running it for 20 months. And the biggest challenge there in terms of a choice is shedding your identity as a founder. And so I've really had to shed my own skin around, being an aid worker, being a 𝗵𝗺 expert, running the Timor-Leste Food Lab and Agora Food Studio. And all of a sudden, that's not the main sort of title on my LinkedIn profile anymore.
I do want to go back to what you were saying about making that decision to leave your job with the German government, because I think I've met so many people now grappling with that, especially after COVID, when people start thinking about what should my life and my work life situation look like now? How do I make sure that I'm not just doing things because it was how we've always done things? And I think, of course, COVID was a catalyst for that. What were the questions you asked? What did you do to leave that full-time job? Did you have to make sure you had a buffer of X months before you did that? Did you talk to your partners? Did you make sure, to what degree of certainty were you comfortable to say, okay, now I'm ready to leave? Or was it just, okay, whatever, I'll throw caution to the wind and do this and see where it takes me?
Probably more the latter, but with a financial buffer. But finances had never been the main game for me. I felt like my identity was much more caught up in, and we can all admit this, in what do people around you think about are you doing a good job? Are you a good aid worker? So I'd always prided myself on the fact that I was a hard worker and innovative and providing opportunities. But if it wasn't for the work I'd done in development, I wouldn't have developed the skills around facilitating for people around you to then take responsibility and grow. And here's the crux of that for me, which is definitely ego driven and nothing to be ashamed of. And for people that are stuck or feel stuck, you have to grow as well. You have to progress as well. I mean, you don't have to. You can stay and do the same thing. But the point is, so I had a burning desire to grow in the roles I was in. And perhaps I didn't want to be doing the same thing last year as I was doing this year. And for some people, that's moving up a corporate ladder of change. For other people, that's moving across different industries. But for me, I just knew that I didn't want to ever flatline as a performer. And so one of my philosophies around work is really, and I'm very comfortable moving people in a job and changing it up. And when I see the stagnation around me, when someone, you've been in the media and you see some copy and there's a spelling error, you get this feeling of, you want it to be better. So I get that feeling with people within my work ecosystem where I see the little flatlining. And I don't, it's better to pick up someone when they're here and they're flatlining than when they're down there, because it's when people are down there that you can actually get a more toxic work environment. You can actually get people's confidence can really dip. So you really want to observe people where they are on their growth trajectory and do those regular check-ins. And it doesn't have to be performance management for me. It's very much like, how are you going? What's giving you joy, and what's keeping you up at night? And from that, have a conversation to give people a growth opportunity. And the part of that that's my part is like, well, I need to grow as well. So I want to basically build up people around me to take my job and make myself obsolete. And that's what we came into the aid industry to do. And that's what many people in the industry that I come from don't do. They do stay in those roles forever. And that's called founder syndrome in a way. So I just was so determined not to sort of fall into that trap and stagnate.
So your choices when you felt like you were ready for change, you did that, of course, on your own accord. But when COVID happened, you were forced to come back to Australia, and you were forced to shed, as you said, your identity as founder of Agora Food Studios. So how do you deal with that kind of change where you wasn't really your plan?
I think for me personally, it was the greatest opportunity of all. And I recognize for a lot of people, it was a terrible time. So what I mean by that is it's, I look for KPIs around moments in conversations. So in some of the work that I'm doing now. So for example, if you're working with someone from, let's say, a lower socioeconomic background, it could be a woman with a low education, and they're very much used to being sort of at the back end of a conversation, ignored, shunned, even put down, and that person, if working with someone like a 𝗫𝗫, for example, who got to a point in the early stages of COVID where she could actually say, oh, I used to think that I couldn't do this, and now I can do this. So that's a moment of gold that's worth so much, that moment, that a person can come to you and say, I never used to believe in myself, and now that I do. Now, the leverage point there is to take that information from 𝗫𝗫 and make sure that she's teaching the next person and telling her story. And so she's one example of a person that we worked with from the start who was always like, oh, my English is not good, or I can't speak in public, or I don't know how to do this. That's so common, I guess, globally, but particularly in Timor, where young people have been so oppressed and so put down and put in their place. And so why that's good for me is because I get my little spark out of that. I'm like, oh wow, this person that I've worked with has reached it's a quantum leap in their confidence. And so the lesson out of that is to lead the leaders, if you like, teach the teachers, facilitate the facilitators. But for me, the change that was forced upon us had the greatest dividend, because those moments came out where people were forced to take extra responsibility, and they did it. They had no trouble doing it, actually, but they had told themselves that they couldn't do it. And so the point there is that, as a leader or as a founder, you can be a shadow and you can feel really useful and you can be in the savior mode. And then to get out of there and to see that growth, like a teenager sort of coming of age, is an incredible feeling. And you grow from that because you can kind of go, wow, this ecosystem's rocking. Like, what do we do now? Let's take it to the next level.
Yeah. So where are you now, a few years in, back in Australia? Where have you taken yourself? What new level have you taken yourself? And what are the projects that you were involved in now?
I took myself into a different direction for a few years, from 2021 up until the middle of this year, with multicultural marketing agency 𝘁𝗵𝗁 that my friend and CEO 𝗪 Raghavan has been running for a long time. And he took me into the fold where there was a project or a program at the nexus of international development and multicultural marketing, supporting Australian and New Zealand based Pacific Island diaspora and workers who are sending money back home through the remittances to support their families back in the islands. So it was kind of a natural fit for me to come back in, work on development programs, but with the growth area for me, which was in multicultural marketing. And that led me to, in 2023, as you know, leading the strategy and the team for the FIFA Women's World Cup multicultural engagement program. So 𝘁𝗁𝗁 had the contract with FIFA to fill essentially our brief was to fill the stadiums of the non-Matildas and the non-New Zealand Ferns games. And so I got to learn so much in multicultural marketing from the team at 𝘁𝗁𝗁, move into the sports arena, which I hadn't been in previously, but by necessity, I was ready to take on something different. And that was a great growth opportunity for me to sort of understand the domestic landscape in Australia, where we now have, as you know, more than 50% of the population has a culturally and linguistically diverse background. And those skills and those networks and opportunities I've taken forward through my own work in the last 6 months. I've gone out on my own. I'll be launching my own company, 𝘬𝗲𝗄𝗄, next year, which is a private consultancy focused on supporting leaders with empathetic leadership. And also I've been working on a concept around trust intelligence. So thinking about trust between leaders and their teams, trust within teams, and trust intelligence. I call it a cousin of emotional intelligence. So EQ, I'm calling it TQ. So I want to support leaders build their own trust up amongst themselves, and then the trust between them and their teams and their clients.
I saw that video that you posted. It was a speech that you were making on the topic, and I found that such an interesting concept. And with just 2 words, I think you do get an idea of what you're trying to get at. But can you dive deep into why this is something you see as lacking and what you intend to do with the transition from what is point A and what is point B for these leaders?
I think it comes from my experience in Timor-Leste, having a team where I would say the TQ, the trust intelligence, was very, very high, and it could sustain periods like COVID. It could sustain situations where, someone in the leadership group is going through some personal issues, or it could sustain situations where, you have a dip in income. And I think it comes from recruitment, actually, and starting with trust at the root of recruitment. So meaning, we've all got different characteristics and personality traits, and we want to make sure that when we are meeting together for the first time, or when we're bringing people into the family of our work family, that there's a compatibility there. And not traditionally, we look, and our job descriptions and our KPIs are very based around what I call logos, or what in the Aristotelian framework, there's logos, pathos, and ethos. And my point of departure was that the logical part is very strong in business and in government. The ethos part, which has come in the last 20, 25 years, is often window dressing. Like our values are, transparency and authenticity. And so that's there. And we do have values-based activities and team building exercises. But pathos part, hence the name of my consultancy, 𝘬𝗲𝗄𝗁, empathy and feeling, there's no KPIs around that. So what I'm looking at is establishing KPIs for those teams. So for example, a KPI might be on Sunday evening, how I'm feeling about going to work on Monday morning. a KPI might be how I'm feeling about going to the office. So we're looking at those as KPIs, not as byproducts of our work, but as establishing them as foundational, rather than just having a sales target, rather than just having a target around the number of clients that you meet in a week. And so one of my favorite, I'm calling them KPIs for now, the terminology might change. One of my favorite ones is when my colleague's speaking, I'm really listening. Now, we've all been in situations where that's not the case. We've already checked out when somebody starts to open their mouth because of this lack of trust we have in another person. And so, the power of being in a situation in a team, which I've experienced in flow, where if somebody in that team has an opportunity to go abroad or gets a trip or gets their face in the limelight and everyone in that situation is genuinely happy for them, that's what I'm looking for. That's what I want to help people to achieve. But that has to come with some hard decisions. So logical decisions can only work to a degree when we change our way of working in a business. We change our marketing, but that's a logical thing. It's we change the way that we add an office day, or we take away an office day. We attack it in a logical way, but it's always about that Maya Angelou quote about, people always remember how you make them feel. So I want to help leaders on the feeling side and create the feeling of trust in a team. And how to do that is basically measure trust as a baseline to start with, and then give them a program of activities to build trust for themselves and then with their teams.
As you were talking there, I had a lot of questions coming up, and then you would answer them as you kept talking. So that was great. But what I want to get at is, because I think it's great that you're putting structure and terminology that would resonate with the business types, the more rational logos-based types out there. I am coming up with courses that help with quiet strength, the introverts in the workplace, and also making a workplace more inclusive of different communication styles, because we miss out on so many things, and encouraging thought leadership from a point of view of contributing to public discourse. Now, when you put that structure, because a lot of the thinking, I think, around these skills are that they're soft skills. Like, I don't know why communication skills are considered soft skills when they are so crucial to business and to making money and to running teams. And I've read quite a few articles that say communication skills are no longer considered soft skills, or at least that's changing. What are your thoughts around that? Because you're teaching something, when you say feelings, imagine walking into a board and telling them, I'm going to talk to you about feelings. That's, you've been about it yourself. We've worked in these environments. How does that fly? And do you think we're ready for that now? I know there's a need. You don't have to convince me. You're preaching to the choir. I'm convinced it's needed. But are we ready for that right now? And how are you going to present that?
Are we ready for it? Well, let me start by saying we're ready to stop calling soft skills. They're not soft skills. They're just foundational and fundamental, and almost more important than the so-called hard skills. Are we ready? I think the first step is awareness. So when it comes to deep listening, and it's hard, right? We've got our passion. We want to get our point of view across. When somebody of, let's say, a so-called introvert is interrupted, that's already an erosion of trust. So for your alphas in the boardroom who are very used to being right and having people dance around them, they're missing out on a lot of trust. They're actually in a trust deficit, partly because of interruption. So it's about bringing awareness to them that there could be a different way of doing things. And it's probably more reflective of the era that we're in, both in terms of COVID and our awareness and all the books we read on neurodiversity and neuroplasticity and introverts and 16 personalities and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's about bringing awareness to people that interrupting it degrades trust. Taking a task off a person that you've asked to do it overnight, you've just eroded trust. So I think a lot of people are not getting the truth from their teams and their employees, if you can use that word, around why they don't get information. Well, why didn't they tell me? It's like we are resisting. People resist. So there's a great Foucault quote, which I always think about, which is, where there is power, there is resistance, right? We've seen it in Syria in the last week. We'll see it in another country soon. So I think, when you really have trust, it means you've been listening well and you've been asking the right questions. And that seems, for a lot of leaders, that seems inefficient. Oh, I don't have time to do that. It's not. It's the opposite. I think it's actually efficient. It's very efficient. You don't have to have the same conversations again and again if you have trust. What's really troubling you? What's really on your mind? You don't seem happy about that. What's going on there? Now, if that person has my trust, they'll say, yeah, Mark, you're right. Thanks for picking that up. I wanted to tell you, and I'm going to tell you. And if that person doesn't have your trust, they're going to say, no, it's okay. I mean, I'm not happy about this, but anyway, they're going to not give you that information. So I think trust is about getting good information. How are we going to do it? I think it's a work in progress. I'm starting with the sector that I know best. So I'm starting with humanitarian leaders. I've got a couple of projects through the Rotary Peace Fellow Network that I'm a part of, and with people that are founders and people that have fallen into the savior trap over the years, where, they're the only person that can solve a problem. But we know that's not true, right? We know our kids grow up, and we know that when people have autonomy and they have resources, they can achieve great things. But I'll just repeat that quote: where there is power, there is resistance. So that power dynamic has to be in equilibrium. So that's also a KPI I'm looking at, is a KPI around power dynamics.
And I really like that KPI about how you feel on a Sunday evening about going to work. That, I think, is a huge gauge of whether or not you should still be in the job that you're in or not, because the Monday blues, it's rooted in something I think very fundamental. And I want to drill down on what we just discussed here, that these soft skills are foundational skills. You cannot, your knowledge, is useless if you don't know how to deal with your team, if you don't know how to communicate. And I think, yes, I don't like the term soft skills because it doesn't do it justice.
Yeah, they're much harder to master, aren't they? And I think, we've come from sort of a didactic educational culture, right? Lecturer telling us what to do, parents telling us what to do in the home. And then all of a sudden, we're starting to figure out the human condition a bit more now. You could say people are more sensitive. That's probably true for a lot of the Western world that hasn't been exposed to war. People want to be heard. So if I feel like there's something around the relationship between the level to which a person feels heard and the actual effort that they put in. So I think there's an 80-20 rule or something like that going on there. So a person who's really talented but doesn't quite feel heard is putting in 80%. For your business, that's an inefficiency. You're not going to get the extra 20% out of that person. So there will be quiet quit, long-term quiet quit. And those people are they're sitting next to us sometimes. Now, they might be demotivated for their own purposes. They might have health issues, a family issue, but having trust as a leader means you do get to the point of understanding some of that, and you can put it back on them and say, look, I've been noticing your performance, and being honest about it, and not in a mechanical way. Here's a piece of paper and you rated a 1 out of. That's not going to work. People are always going to get defensive when you use a performance management system where you're judging them and they don't already feel heard. So I think, that Sunday night KPI is a good one. And there's a bunch of others that I'm happy to, come on again one day and share them with you.
Yeah, I would love to. I was going to say, I'm going to keep in touch with you. I'd love to know, because one of the things that I'm also trying to come up with is how to teach these things, because they're not as you would memorize facts from a book. It really isn't. It's, I don't know, it's more fluid, and it takes more time to teach people something like that. As much as I'd love giving steps 1 to 5, and I think people respond well to steps 1 to 5, this is how you do it, this is what you say, I think it requires a lot more involvement and engagement than that. And I think I've answered my own question, but I do want to throw it back at you in case you haven't answered it yet. When I want to know if there's something that you've learned from your career or your life, an insight that you wish more people understood. For me, that's about the soft skills and foundational skills. What is it for you?
Well, there are oh so many, Tessa, and not time to capture them today. And it's a journey. I don't, I'm sort of maybe in the middle part of my career, so I'm hoping to collect those every day. Those little revelations. And I think it's definitely around observing people, reading between the lines. I've learned a lot from the high context cultures that I've been in and a part of: Timor-Leste, Indonesia, Japan. The difference between what people say and what they mean. Trying to understand that, and that requires, again, opening your eyes and ears and shutting your mouth. That's hard. So probably something around just being patient and to trust that things can work out when we have that sort of human information beyond the information that's in the brief and the post you're doing for LinkedIn or whatever. There's this human information that sits behind that. And then I think there's never a check-in, there's never a quick phone check-in in this modern age that is not worth doing. So in other words, if you feel like you need to communicate, pick up the phone or say something, say it. I always err on the side of, if in doubt, get it out. But a phrase that I've used with you is choreograph the space and not the people. So you've got to be sensitive about that, doing it in front of colleagues, those kind of scenarios that we get into in the office sometimes. You've got to be discreet. And that means taking a bit more time with people. And I just believe that pays dividends. I think that's that's like a stock investment early on. It's going to pay dividends if people feel, wow, this person really cares about me. Not in a family sense. We don't need workplaces to be families. I think that's too far. But again, getting back to being listened to. And then I think if there's a phrase that I really like to use, and I don't always use it and I want to use it all the time, but when somebody comes to you as a leader with a problem, with all of their baggage, it's so tempting to get into the ideas space and the solution space. And I think the most powerful phrase is, what do you think you can do about it? Just say it. What do you think you can do about it? Say it 5 times. What do you think you can do about it? It can feel tedious. But again, the dividend, if we sort of get beyond the short-term brain of a human, the dividend pays off, because a person that walks away who can figure something out for themselves, even if you come in at the end and you top and tail it, you refine that piece of copy or you edit it in a little better way in your industry, I think the payment on the investment there is incredible when people figure things out for themselves, because they do look up to you as a boss or a leader. So there's more, but there's a few there that I just try to keep in my, not my back pocket, but in my top pocket. And probably the other one is this Aristotelian framework: logos, pathos, and ethos. Just if we're really heavy on logos in a team as well, if we're very cerebral and we're just talking ideas all the time, it's got to go back to the feeling. It's got to go back to the space. Include food in and around what you do as much as possible. Food and coffee, those things make a big difference. And people don't want gimmicks at work. They don't need the table tennis table necessarily. They don't need the funny couches. They just need the feeling that there's some kind of appreciation of them and some kind of nourishing. So those, food and coffee, the importance of that. In many, as you know, in many Asian cultures, when Australia's engaging overseas, it can't be underestimated how impactful that is. So I do draw a lot of inspiration from the Japanese with 𝗏𝗏, the Chinese with guangxi, my own background, the Greek concept of philotimos, sort of hospitality that is kind of seen as being part of your value set, showing that to people, celebrating birthdays, those kind of things really make a difference, particularly as a leader, if you show interest and you're engaged in your team.
A lot of the things that you said are very applicable to raising children. Actually, with our 8-year-old boys, they're like, so, well, what do you think you should do? What do you think the solution is? It's so true. And just giving them the autonomy. I really would love to see where TQ ends up and how it develops and how you talk about that concept a lot more to get it out there. But before I end this podcast, I really would like you to leave our listeners with something to reflect on. So if there's a challenge, something you would like to, just something to provoke their thinking or to challenge them to reflect on, what would you like them to think about? What would it be?
So many things, but I think the one that, has resonated with me in the last 6 months and is just finding my authentic voice. And the platform on which you do it is not important. You can do it on LinkedIn and for your career, and you can do it through your side hustle on Instagram or drop shipping or, through your music, through your food. But, finding your authentic voice, I think people deep down really respect authenticity. Yes, we do put our best face on when we go to work and we dress up and we use the right phrases. But I think sometimes there's a deeper value that comes from finding your voice. And I think speaking your voice, again, it doesn't mean interrupting. It doesn't mean you're right. It's almost just like, here's what I think, and letting other people just deal with that rather than trying to win arguments. I'll probably add one on the back of that is, and I've found, like everyone, I enjoy a good debate, but I'm trying to never debate. And I don't mean not share my ideas, but this adversarial kind of, I need to bring you down to get my idea forward. It's so tempting. It's probably what we've grown up with in many cultures. And just that idea of trying to work ideas out together without having to win the little battles along the way, because our egos will want to do that. And so it's okay not to win every battle, including as a leader and a boss. So, perfection can be the enemy of progress for sure. And comfort is the enemy of growth. So there's a couple of things there. So sit back a bit more, watch a bit more, listen a bit more, eat together a bit more, and just let it go a bit more. And I think you'll find flow is possible. And if that sounds all woo-woo, well, you've got to figure out what works for you. But for me, I think, having the people around you trust you and you trusting them is the foundation upon which success or that kind of growth where you're all growing comes out of. So I guess my provocation is, what is your level of trust intelligence with yourself, with your team and the people around you? And if there's a trust issue, why are you staying there, or why are they staying there? Hard decisions. You've got to make hard decisions sometimes about people, but the benefits will show in the long term.
That's the great note to end with. Thank you so much, Mark. Also, just to add on to what you were saying about people wanting to be right, a lot of very intelligent people, great leaders, are out there to prove themselves wrong. So they kind of, gather as much information as they could, and it's a sign of growth when you go, oh, I think you might be right. Let me incorporate that into my knowledge and my thinking, and then you've grown. But interestingly enough, that's probably not done as often as we should. And on that note, thank you so much, Mark. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat today.
Thank you, Tessa. I'm so excited about all your hustles now, the podcast and also the book coming out next year. So just a shout out for your viewers there. This is a great book coming out next year, which Tessa will talk
Thank you.
So
thank you so much. I'm so nervous about it, but yeah, I've never written anything that personal, so really scared, but there it is. It's coming out next year. So thank you so much, Mark.
Thanks, Tessa. Ciao.
If you enjoyed this episode, please consider giving us a 5-star rating so others can find the podcast. Thank you for your company and see you next time.